It has now been 2 years since I started my podcast, Internationally by Ruth, and one of the main realizations I've had over the last 2 years is the importance of sharing our authentic stories with others. As the world is becoming more globalized and people are becoming more interconnected thanks to technology, sharing our authentic stories not only teaches us how to be vulnerable, but also compassionate with each other. I came up with the idea to start my podcast during the COVID-19 pandemic while I was cleaning my bathroom and listening to a podcast episode of Jesus and Jollof by Yvonne Orji and Lavi Ajay, two Nigerian Americans who talk about their experiences as immigrants in the United States. In this particular episode, Lavi talked about how we each have dreams and aspirations, but always make excuses for not following through. At one point, she said, if you want to start your own podcast, there's this free app called Anchor, and you can just record from your phone. In the middle of scrubbing my bathroom floor, that sentence stuck with me. Later that night, I opened up my phone, went on the App Store, and sure enough, there was this app called Anchor that provides you with all the tools that you need to make your own podcast. So once I realized the platform existed, I asked myself, hypothetically, if I were to have my own podcast, what would it be about? Immediately, I knew it would be about my experience as an international student, because earlier that year, I had written an article titled, How to Not Only Survive, but Also Thrive in College as an International Student, reflecting back on my own experience as an international student from Ethiopia at Smith College in the United States. And I remember feeling like I had more to share even after I finished writing the article. So, having a podcast where I get to talk about my experience as an international student and also invite guests to be on the show seemed like the perfect idea. I ended up recording the trailer for the podcast that very same night, and the rest is history. I was initially apprehensive about sharing my story so publicly and was even worried that I wouldn't find guests to be on my show. However, after interviewing almost 20 international students, all with different backgrounds, I came to understand that everyone has a story to share. Everyone has an experience they will never forget, and everyone has a lesson to teach others. When I first started my podcast, my main goal was to authentically share the experiences of international students abroad. I felt the need to do this because the stories of international students do not get discussed as much. A lot of emphasis is placed on helping students apply abroad, but what actually happens once the students are in school? What unique challenges do they face as international students? I wanted the podcast to be a space where other students could get a glimpse into our lives and maybe avoid some of the same mistakes that we made. You might be surprised to hear that during the 2019-2020 school year, there were 1,075,496 international students who were enrolled in US colleges and universities. International students also contributed $39 billion to the American economy in 2020 alone. This by itself is an indicator of the vast amount of knowledge and experiences that international students have, and also of the many untapped stories international students can share. While doing this podcast, I learned how to authentically share my story, and through that experience, I learned how to ask deep and meaningful questions to my guests. I wanted the conversation to flow organically, so I don't have a set of questions or a script. Instead, I wanted people listening to feel like they were part of a conversation where stories are shared, tears are shed, and laughter is the most common sound. Once, a friend of mine told me, Your podcast is one of the greatest things to come out of this pandemic, and I guess I have COVID to thank for that. Because if it wasn't for the time that I had while working from home, I wouldn't have had the drive to start my own podcast. And for someone who did not enjoy listening to podcasts until very recently, it was not only a challenge, but also an adventure for me. So, why should we share our authentic stories? Here are the 3 main reasons why I believe we should share our stories authentically. Number 1, vulnerability paves the way for understanding. One of the reasons why I think my podcast has been a success so far is because I discuss topics that are not usually talked about. Some of the topics include dealing with representation, expectations, challenges, loneliness, just to name a few. I remember doing an episode titled Dealing with Loss and Wellness with the guest Beatty, where we talked about our experiences about dealing with grief while being students in college. It was the first time that I was sharing my experience, and I felt almost stripped of the protective layer that I had built for myself. However, being vulnerable taught me that the guest also felt comfortable to share their story, and the people who listened to our episode shared with us how much they appreciated how honest we were about our experiences. Thus, being vulnerable is powerful because in vulnerability, we develop a common understanding with one another about our human experience. And that understanding ultimately leads to compassion. 2, we become more comfortable with dealing with difficult topics. I believe the greatest lessons are learned at the edge of discomfort. There's a reason why some topics get labeled as difficult. It might be because it makes us feel uncomfortable, ashamed, or even embarrassed. However, it is imperative to understand that when we discuss so-called difficult topics, we not only create an awareness about the topic to someone who might not even know anything about it, but we also challenge ourselves to step outside of our comfort zones and embrace the not-so-cushy feelings that we have. In a recent episode titled Dealing with Mental Well-Being, I discussed with the guest Beatty about our experiences and struggles of mental health while being students in college. Growing up in Ethiopia, where it is considered even taboo to discuss a topic like this, it felt validating to realize that our experiences are not singular. In fact, it is a collective struggle. We talked about the importance of prioritizing our mental health and asking for help when we needed it most. These lessons apply not just to international students, but also to everyone else. 3, our stories matter, regardless of where we're from. This one is big. Depending on the environment or the culture that we grew up in, on the road to adulthood, we somehow become conditioned by society to fit into the narrative of what is deemed acceptable. This is true, particularly for girls, who are most of the time raised to be humble and to not speak up, even when we desperately want to. While doing this podcast, I noticed the lack of stories shared by not just women, but also women from the African continent. A lot of times, our stories get told by someone else, someone who does not have the same lived experience, someone who may put us in a box and give us labels. That is why I'm passionate about sharing the authentic stories of international students, not just because I feel like our stories are missing from the mainstream narrative, but also because it could serve as an inspiration to a younger listening. The power of storytelling is that it opens up our minds and it broadens our understanding about the world. When we authentically share our stories, we realize that we're not alone. We become compassionate, not just towards each other, but also towards ourselves. The facade that we have built in the name of protecting ourselves eventually wears off when we authentically share our stories. So, the next time you meet someone, whether it is a familiar face or even a complete stranger, share your story with them as authentically as possible. Be open, be bold, But most importantly, be open to listening, because everyone has a story to share. Thank you.